The letter was folded into thirds beneath her husband's blotter, and Georgiana Morse found it only because she had come looking for the previous quarter's mill receipts, which Sebastian had borrowed 3 days ago and not returned. She pulled it free. She read the first line, then she read it again. Then she stood very still in the center of Sebastian's study, still wearing the blue wool dress she had pressed the night before, the one she had chosen specifically for the morning's signing ceremony, and read the rest of the letter from beginning to end without moving. Vernon Aldrich had written it 9 days ago. His handwriting was precise and unhurried, the handwriting of a man who had never doubted that his correspondence was private. He congratulated Sebastian on the careful preparation of the deed amendment documents, and noted, with the comfortable ease of a man writing to a trusted partner about a nearly completed task, that once Georgiana added her signature that morning, the matter would be concluded. She understands the document as a standard update, Aldrich had written. She will not look further than what we have told her to look for. She never has. Georgiana set the letter down. If you are new to Victorian bonds, please stay with Georgiana's story all the way to the end. You will not want to leave before you see what she does next. And drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to know how far this story reaches. She pressed both hands flat against the desk and looked at the far wall, where Sebastian kept a framed map of the Massachusetts coastline above a shelf of law books she had never once seen him open. She had always assumed the books were decorative. Standing here now, she understood they probably were. She picked the letter back up and read it a second time. Her father, Gordon Harwick, had told her once. She was 12 years old, sitting across from him in the mill office while he reviewed a shipping contract, that the most expensive mistake a person could make in business was to act on information before they had truly understood it. Read it twice, he had said. Read it until you can say back every name and every number without the page in front of you. Only then do you know what you are actually dealing with. She could recite every name and every number. She knew exactly what she was dealing with. She had married Sebastian Morse at 23, not for love, but because her father's mill was failing, and her father was too proud to say so plainly. The arrangement had presented itself as straightforward, in the way that such things always presented themselves as straightforward. Sebastian came from a Boston family with capital. Georgiana came from a Granger family with a mill that needed it, and Vernon Aldrich, her father's oldest business associate, a man who had known her since she was small enough to sit beneath the mill office desk and listen to adults talk, had made the introduction. She had liked Sebastian reasonably well. He was composed, not unintelligent, and he did not speak to her as though she were furniture, which she had come to understand, by 23, was something worth valuing in a man. She had not loved him. She had not expected to. She had told herself that something like affection might develop between them eventually, the way warmth comes back into a room after a cold evening. Slowly, without announcement, simply present one morning when it had not been the morning before. By the 3rd year of their marriage, she had stopped expecting it. What she felt towards Sebastian had resolved into something more honest if less comfortable, the clear assessment of a woman who had shared a house and a name with a man long enough to know him accurately. He was careful with his words. He traveled to Boston with a frequency she had stopped questioning. He had the particular talent. She had noticed it early and filed it away, of appearing interested in things he was not interested in, and of making people feel heard without telling them anything of substance in return. She had told herself this was manageable. Many marriages contained less. What she had not known, because she had not been meant to know, was that Sebastian Morse had not arrived at her father's mill by coincidence. Her father had died 14 months ago, leaving the Harwick textile mill entirely to Georgiana. She was the only child, and she had been managing the mill's accounts since she was 19, when her father's eyesight began to fail him, and she had simply taken over the ledgers, the way you take over a task from someone you love without being asked. She knew every contract, every supplier, every worker's name and output record, and the particular way the second loom on the north floor vibrated differently from the others when the shuttle tension was off. She had managed the mill alone for 14 months. She had kept every contract and renegotiated 2 for better terms. She had brought in a new client from Providence, who now represented nearly a fifth of their quarterly revenue. She had done this while being married to a man who traveled, on average, twice a month to Boston, and who had never shown any particular interest in textiles. She had trusted Vernon Aldrich. She had trusted him with the unexamined confidence of someone who has known a person their entire life, and has never had cause to revise the assumption. He had lifted her onto his shoulders at the 4th of July when she was 4. He had wept in the front row at her father's funeral, genuinely and without performance, the grief of a man who has lost someone who mattered. She understood now, reading the letter in her husband's study, that she had been wrong about all of it. She folded the letter into thirds and put it in the pocket of her dress, below the watch pin that had been her mother's. Then she went to find Elias Reeves. Sebastian Morse stood in the foyer at 9:30, hat in hand, and thought about what the morning was supposed to look like. It was supposed to be simple. It was supposed to be the last step in a plan that had been running, quietly, carefully, with no room for error, for the better part of 3 years. The signing would take 20 minutes. Georgiana would read the documents the way she always read legal documents, carefully, but within the frame she had been given. She would see an updated deed description, a standard county filing requirement, the kind of paperwork that accumulated around a property like sediment around a river stone. She would sign. He had told himself, when Aldrich had first laid out the arrangement, that it was a matter of business. The Harwick Mill was a sound asset being managed conservatively, not poorly. He had always granted that. Georgiana ran it more capably than most men he knew, but conservatively, in a way that left value sitting unrealized. Aldrich's structure would change that. He had said so. He had made it sound like a correction of an imbalance, not a theft. Sebastian had been 28 years old, and looking for a way to make something of himself that his family's money alone was not providing. The plan had appeared, as plans do when you are young and ambitious, and not yet acquainted with the weight of what you are agreeing to, as an opportunity. 3 years had not made him love Georgiana. He was honest enough with himself to acknowledge that. But 3 years had given him a complete and accurate understanding of who she was, and who she was turned out to be considerably more than Aldrich had described when the arrangement was first presented. She was precise, she was fair, she had sat across from him at dinner hundreds of times, and been more interesting company than he had any right to expect from a woman who knew, on some level, that the man across from her had never been entirely what he had appeared. She had never once said so. She had simply continued. Managing the mill, reviewing the accounts, running things with the particular steady competence of someone who has never needed to be told they are capable, because they have always simply been capable. He had kept telling himself it was business. The telling had gotten harder. He heard her on the stairs and turned, and when she came into the foyer, something in her face made him stop the habitual pleasantness before it reached his expression. She had found it. He did not know how he knew, he simply did. Reeves had managed the Harwick Mill floor for 22 years. He was already at his desk in the mill office at 8:30 when Georgiana came through the door, and he looked up at her with the sharpened attention of a man who had known a girl since she was 4 years old, and could read the difference between her ordinary face and the face she wore when she had made a decision. She told him what she needed. He did not ask why. He brought her the accounts ledger for the past 18 months. He brought her the county deed copy. He told her, with the carefully steady tone of a man correcting an error of judgment in real time, that he had seen the deed amendment documents when Sebastian had left them on the office table 3 weeks ago, and that the language had struck him as broader than a standard update, and that he had told himself he was not trained to interpret legal forms. "I should have brought it to you immediately," he said. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Morse." She looked at him for a moment. "You're bringing it to me now," she said. "Sit down." She went through the ledgers. She found the pattern the way she always found things in accounts, by reading everything and paying attention to the small anomalies that were individually unremarkable, but accumulated, over time, into a shape. There was a Boston law firm she had never authorized. There were 2 filing fees for the same survey, each attributed to a different party in a different column. There was a notation for consultancy payments to a company called Aldrich and Morse Holdings that she had never heard of and had certainly never agreed to. She laid the original mill deed next to the amendment Sebastian had presented 3 weeks ago as a routine update. The amendment altered the controlling interest language. It was written to look like a description correction. It was not. It was a transfer of management rights, of operational authority, of effective ownership, from the Harwick Mill's sole legal heir into a holding company that did not include her name, her interest, or any role for her at all. All Georgiana needed to do was sign. She set both documents down. "Get me the married women's property schedule," she said. "The filing from when the mill transferred to me at father's death." Reeves got it. She read it. She thought about what the 1855 Massachusetts Act said about separate property, property owned before marriage, inherited during marriage, and what it required to transfer such property legally, and what constituted informed consent versus something that had been carefully dressed to resemble it. She had not yet signed. She had perhaps 90 minutes before the signing was scheduled to begin. She looked at Reeves. "I need you to do 3 things," she said, "and I need them done before 10 o'clock. He got out his notebook. Claudia Brandt was waiting in the front parlor of the Harwick house, as she had been waiting since 9. With the careful stillness of a woman who has been composing herself against a conversation she cannot avoid for several days, and has still not fully managed it. She looked up when Georgiana came in. Her expression was one Georgiana had only seen on people who had carried something too long, and felt the weight of it breaking the surface of their face. Guilt that had been held past the point where it could be fully concealed. "You know," Georgiana said, "it was not a question." "Not everything." Claudia's voice was careful, "I suspected. At the mill's spring gathering last year, Aldrich said something about Sebastian taking a more direct role in property management, and I thought he meant advising you through transitions, not—" She stopped. "I told myself I was reading into it. I told myself you were so capable that even if something was happening, you would see it before it became serious. You could have told me what you observed, and let me decide if it warranted concern." "Yes," Claudia said, "I could have done that. I didn't." Georgiana stood in the doorway and looked at the friend she had known for 20 years. The familiar set of her jaw, the way she pressed her hands together when she was anxious, the face she had known since they were 7 years old, sitting side by side in a schoolroom on Marchfield Street. She let herself feel the weight of it clearly, the full measure of it, without either reducing it or allowing it to become more than it was. "I need to know everything," she said. "Everything Aldrich said. Everything Sebastian told you that you filed away as possibly significant. When the holding company was first mentioned. Any detail about the Boston arrangements or the judge. All of it." Claudia told her. It was enough to confirm what the ledgers had already revealed. And then it was one thing more. "Before the wedding," Claudia said near the end. She said it quietly, her eyes on the floor. "The holding company, Aldrich mentioned it to Sebastian before the wedding. I was there, I overheard it, I didn't understand what I was hearing." A pause. "I think I understood more than I admitted to myself." The parlor was very quiet. Georgiana stood with that for a moment. She thought about Vernon Aldrich introducing Sebastian Morse to her father's household as a fortunate coincidence of timing. She thought about the precision with which that introduction had been constructed. The right occasion, the right framing, the right sequence to make a designed meeting appear accidental. She thought about a plan that had been running not for 3 years but for 4. Beginning before she had ever shaken Sebastian Morse's hand. Beginning at the desk of a man she had trusted completely and without examination. The marriage itself had been the first step. She breathed in slowly, breathed out. "Fix your face," she said. "I need you composed this morning. What comes after this, we will have that conversation. But right now I need you functional." Claudia nodded. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment, then she straightened. It was not a graceful recovery. It was an honest one, which was, Georgiana thought, the more useful kind. Vernon Aldrich was already in the mill office when they arrived, standing with the comfortable ease of a man on familiar ground, discussing the spring output figures with Reeves, in the tone of a person who has mentally begun reorganizing a room that does not yet belong to him. He turned when Georgiana came through the door, and his face arranged itself into the warm expression she had known her entire life. The full warmth of a man who had watched her grow up and loved her. She had believed, in the particular way of family friends, who become indistinguishable from family. She stood and looked at that expression for a moment and let herself understand, completely and without flinching, how long it had worked. Sebastian stood to his left. He was watching her, not Aldrich. His face held no performance. There was something in it she had almost never seen in 3 years of marriage. The look of a man who has not yet decided what to do and knows it. "Before we proceed," Georgiana said, setting her portfolio on the desk, "I would like Reeves to read both documents aloud. The amendment you prepared, and the deed confirmation I drafted this morning, based on the 1855 property schedule and the original county filing." The silence had a particular texture. Aldrich's expression held for a moment, then made the smallest possible adjustment. A fraction of a degree, the way a door settles on a warped frame when you push it. He looked at Sebastian. Sebastian was looking at Georgiana. Reeves read both documents in the clear, unhurried voice he used for everything that mattered. The voice of a man who understood that the way you said a thing was part of what the thing meant. When he finished, no one spoke for several seconds. "The amendment you prepared," Georgiana said to Aldrich, "transfers operational control of property held under my name as separate property under Massachusetts law into a holding company in which I have no ownership stake and no named role. The confirmation I prepared acknowledges the existing deed as it stands and records that no transfer has occurred." She held his gaze steadily. "I have not signed your document. I will not be signing it." Aldrich set his pen down with a small, precise sound. He looked at her with the expression of a man who is recalculating rapidly and finding that the exits he had prepared are fewer than he had planned for. "Georgiana." Her name in his voice, warm and familiar, entirely deliberate. "I think there may be some confusion about what these documents accomplish. This is a standard restructuring." "It is not standard," she said. "I have been reading mill documents since I was 19. I know what standard looks like." She looked at Sebastian. Sebastian had not spoken. He was still looking at her, and his face had settled into something that surprised her even now. Not calculation. Something beneath calculation. Something with the shape of a recognition that had been deferred for a very long time and could not be deferred any further. "You found the letter," he said. It was not a question. "The left side of your blotter doesn't lie flat," she said. "It hasn't for months. I mentioned it twice." Something moved across his face then. She would think about it later and not be able to name it precisely, except that it contained a quality she had rarely seen from him. The look of a man who has been given, at the very last possible moment, a chance to know himself accurately, and who is choosing, for the first time in a long time, not to look away from it. "I'll need you to leave," she said to Aldrich, "both of you." Aldrich left. He was composed about it, because he was not a man who became visibly uncomposed in front of people if he could avoid it. But he gathered his papers and he left. Sebastian stood for a moment longer. He stood in the mill office in the room that smelled of linen fiber and ledger ink, and he looked at his wife across the desk that had been her father's, and he said, "I should explain how it started." "It started before I ever met you," she said. "That is explanation enough." He nodded, the nod of a man who cannot argue the point and knows it. He picked up his hat. He walked to the door and then stopped, with his hand on the frame, and said, without turning around, "You run this mill better than anyone I have ever observed run anything." He said it plainly, without sentiment or apology, which was the only way it could have been said without sounding like a negotiation. Then, he walked out. She stood alone in the mill office for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she sat down at her father's desk and began writing the first of the letters that needed to be written before noon. The legal work took months, and she did most of it the way she did everything. One correct step after another, without drama, without waiting to feel ready before she was required to act. Aldrich's lawyer reviewed the evidence, the letter, the ledger notations, the holding company filings, the testimony of Judge Garvey, who withdrew his involvement with the particular speed of a man who had recognized a bad situation from the inside, and advised his client that the matter was not defensible. The married women's property schedule was unambiguous. The letter was in Aldrich's own hand. The consultancy charges had been filed without authorization and could be demonstrated as such. Settlement negotiations began in October and concluded in November with a figure that repaid the mill in full for the unauthorized fees and a signed acknowledgement that no deed transfer had occurred or would occur. Georgiana signed her copy of the settlement at her father's desk, with Reeves standing by the window and the flat November light coming through the glass, at the angle it always came through in late autumn. She signed it the way she signed every document, with full knowledge of what she was agreeing to. Claudia gave her statement to the attorney 8 days after the signing that had not happened. She sat across from Reeves and dictated 12 pages without stopping, and at the end she had looked at Georgiana and said, quietly, that she understood this was not adequate. That she knew adequate was no longer available to her, but she wanted the record to be complete. Georgiana had looked at her for a long moment. She had thought about 20 years and one season of silence, and what could be built in the space of an honest reckoning. "It helps," she had said. "Come back to work Monday. I need someone who knows the office correspondence." Claudia had come back Monday. The divorce was filed in December and finalized the following autumn. Massachusetts law was not simple in such matters, but it was not impossible, and she had a sound case and a patient attorney and the particular endurance of a woman who has already done the hardest part and knows it. Sebastian did not contest the petition. He sent a letter in January that was brief and specific, that named what he was sorry for rather than simply expressing sorrow in general terms. And she read it twice and put it in the desk drawer and went back to the ledgers. The Harwick Mill's output that year was the highest it had been in 7 years. She was at her father's desk on an evening in late October, finishing the quarterly accounts by lamplight, when Reeves knocked and came in to tell her that the updated property map had arrived from the county surveyor. The corrected filing, incorporating the confirmed deed language, clarifying permanently the northern boundary that Aldrich's attorney had briefly attempted to mark as ambiguous, before abandoning that approach. "Frame it," she said. "Put it next to Father's original survey from 1841. Reeves considered the wall where the original hung. "They'll be a matched pair," he said. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly right." He went. She sat for a moment in the quiet mill office with the lamp burning and the first cold of autumn coming through the window. She always left cracked, because she liked the smell of the river at dusk. She thought about her father sitting at this same desk, reviewing contracts until the light was gone. She thought about what he had left her, not only the ledgers and the loom schedules and the client accounts, but the capacity to read a document until she understood it, to sit with difficult information before she moved on it, to protect a thing by knowing it completely and refusing to be told she did not. She thought about Vernon Aldrich at her father's funeral, weeping in the front row. She allowed herself to hold the complication of it, that the man who had wept had been real, and the man who had written that letter had been real, and both had been the same person. People were not entirely one thing. She had learned that. She was still learning what to do with it. She thought about Sebastian, and the look on his face in the mill office, when he said she ran the mill better than anyone he had observed run anything. She thought it had been the truest thing he had ever said to her, and that it had come too late to be anything except itself. A truth delivered after the time for it had passed. She picked up her pen. She had 2 letters to finish before she went home. One to the Providence client about the spring delivery schedule. One to a new contact in Hartford, who had expressed interest in the mill's output, and with whom she thought, reviewing the preliminary correspondence, there was the possibility of a genuinely good arrangement. She wrote them both. She sealed them and set them with the morning's outgoing mail. She closed the ledger and capped the ink. The mill was hers, the deed was filed, the record was complete, the survey maps, old and new, would hang side by side on the wall by Thursday. She was 26 years old, and she had the rest of her life to build from here, and she understood exactly. Her father had made certain of that, what she was building from. She turned down the lamp and walked out into the October evening, and the cold air came off the river the way it always did in that season, and the mill stood behind her in the dark exactly as it had always stood, and she went home.